Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday's serial. This time I want to talk about James Robinson's Fantastic Four run. In light of recent videos, I want to talk about it a bit more quickly, but I'll see how I do. James Robinson is known for dismantling superheroes, which is interesting because the nature of his run with the Fantastic Four as being the final run that put them to a several year break becomes a kind of exercise in irony. So this first issue deals with this Flash that the Fantastic Four are all in a bad place. Mr. Fantastic doubts himself. Sue is in tears. The Thing is in prison, and the Human Torch is depowered and miserable. Um, and we quickly build to why. Now, there's a series of events, but the big ones that happen are that there's this invasion in New York that comes from the human beings that were part of the Heroes Reborn world, which Franklin, their son, made. And then it was dispatched and mostly forgotten about. And Robinson's playing off of that idea. It's interesting. Um, but this plays in later as things build to where the notable heroes, mostly the Avengers from that world, start to attack. And it's confusing because, like, Thor's attacking them, but Thor's accounted for with whatever the Avengers are doing. Hawkeye attacks Wyatt Wingfoot, but Hawkeye's off doing his own thing. So who's this guy in the brown costume, which I guess was part of the Heroes Reborn? I don't remember. I'm just taking their word for it, going with the story here. And it's interesting in that respect as we're building up this kind of case against the Fantastic Four. And part of what breaks them down too is there's this moment between the Thing and Johnny where, because of the nonsense that happens with the original Sin event, the Thing remembers Johnny's memory of a time that Reed was going to take away the Thingness and Thing ring undo your thing. I don't know. And Johnny botched it because he sat down in this pod for 2 seconds and as he threw off the calculations, whatever. It's a big deal, but what doesn't make sense is, like, the chair doesn't work, and I know there's a reason, but, like, they never retry it again later. Like, that it's weird. The Thing's mad, and then he goes and takes out his anger when Alicia's kidnapped by the puppet master, her father, and kills the puppet master, but apparently he doesn't eventually. But yeah, so he's in jail. There's that. Earlier, when we're dealing with the big attack in New York, that's when Johnny becomes depowered. So there's that. All the while, there's been this building legal case against the Fantastic Four. And what's interesting as that happens is we get the FF from Matt Fraction's run coming in and helping the Fantastic Four, and eventually helps them with the Thing's jailbreak. So they're present, and that's nice to see. Um, the legal case is weird because it's Robinson's raised a tet to be here. Like, if you're gonna do a Robinson Fantastic Four run, this feels like what has to happen when you bring that creator on, is we have to dismantle the Fantastic Four in some way. And he does this by, there's a few different points through the Fantastic Four's history that he points to people being endangered. In particular, in the first issue of the Fantastic Four, they endangered a lot of people when they're going to meet, which Stan was using as a show of power, but here he's like, what about these other people that were traumatized or whatever? And it feels a little like, I get where he's coming from. He's applying realism to the comics, but it's like, the first issue, it felt a little dirty to me. But as he goes on, there's other stuff, like when the Invisible Girl is Malice. A handful of the times that the Thing like destroyed a car for no reason or whatever. But the big one that puts the Fantastic Four in this huge predicament is the fact that the Reed Reed keeps portals to other dimensions that have caused invasions to New York kind of available at all times and running, or has the access to them at all times to open them for whatever reason, and has all these weapons like the ultimate nullifier just lying around. And there's no real check on it. It's very kind of the idea of Civil War, like, where's the registration for this, where's all that, but put on the Fantastic Four, which is interesting where you consider where Reed and the Fantastic Four were during Civil War. I don't know. So that happens. It's an interesting idea, but it is also, you're taking this comic book world and then you're applying these real world ideas to it, to something like the Fantastic Four, which is kind of usually judged above folly. Like, that is the measure by which other entities in the Marvel universe are usually measured against. And by taking the piss out of them like this, it's like, okay, that's interesting, but then you have the Avengers holding up the court order and keeping the Fantastic Four out of the Baxter building when they get back even to their living quarters. And there's a note in there by Robinson about how weird it is that the legal system is moving this quickly against him. We'll get there. But the Avengers upholding this on the Fantastic Four feels like a bizarre double standard, given that they've had their own issues and are more dubious than the Fantastic Four for most things in this sort of thing. Like, he opened a can of worms, but only unto our main protagonist, as it works for this story, without it following through. So it felt a little unnatural, but I don't know. It works out in the end, I guess, by the machinations of how he sets up the plot for plot's sake. As we continue, we get a moment with the original Human Torch coming in, and he's watching over the kids of the Future Foundation while the Fantastic Four are dispersed. And then we have an interesting bit with the Wizard and the Frightful Four and dealing with all of that when the Fantastic Four are at their lowest, which helps build to our climax, actually. And then we get an interlude, although really just the one with the Invisible Woman going to Latveria, where Valeria has run off to, because she's spending time with Doctor Doom and trying to get Doctor Doom to do good for the world. We ultimately find out that Doom isn't trying to do good for the world for good's sake, but just kind of placating her because of his fondness for Valeria. And then that line stops. I'm guessing what happened was Robinson had something to do with Doom, though refreshingly Doom wasn't the end game of this, but Doom is a side character of Fantastic Four, so you have to account for him. And Robinson makes a big deal of how much the Invisible Woman now hates Doom because of more recent events and continuity. Robinson does a really good job of taking continuity of the Fantastic Four and tying it through with maybe a little too much reverence for the original Stan and Jack run. I only say that because he's bringing back stuff from the Stan and Jack run like it is more pernicious than, say, like Hickman's run, which happened far more recently. So I don't know, but it is what it is. You understand why. And then we get an interesting bit of the Thing in prison dealing with She-Thing. And the why there plays to her endgame. We get a good bit with Johnny being rallied up by Spider-Man and Wyatt Wingfoot to get out of his funk. So at this point, we're past the point of that initial issues moment. And we're kind of rebuilding until we get to here where we're back together again. And at this point, we're playing towards the end game. And we find out that Mr. Fantastic, in the meanwhile, has been employed by someone who doesn't actually exist. Eventually, this person reveals themselves as the Quiet Man. Dumb name, whatever. The Quiet Man is this character who is spurned by Sue Richards, Sue Storm back in the day, for Reed Richards, and he never got over it, but he was also this hyper intelligent person, and he rued the day, and so he's been quietly pushing things against the Fantastic Four and building resources and staying in the background to make their lives miserable since before they were the Fantastic Four. It's a weird idea. It kind of works though for two reasons. A lot of the machinations of what Robinson's doing specifically only works if you have this kind of unseen hand that has legal people in his pocket, judges, congressmen, so on and so forth, to put pressure on the Fantastic Four. Otherwise, their funds go away, and a bunch of other resources, because he's one of those shadow uh, rich people that are above all because of the sheer amount of money they have. And also, what it does for the continuity is all the confluence over the Fantastic Four and all the focus on them throughout the years. Having an unseen hand kind of pushing as much misery their way as possible creates an interesting explanation for some of the more bonkers idea of why is this happening to them, why is this happening to them again throughout the years. And it's a fun little continuity play without being too heavy-handed or too over-explained. Whereas I think this was really well done in this regard, unlike in Marvel Knights Spider-Man, where there's supposed to be this conspiracy against him, and it was this rich cabal pushing against superheroes, and was supposed to explain the entire Marvel universe through money matters. It doesn't work because it was too much specifics on how things are supposed to work, with kind of a, not a full face, but like an organization behind it, and then to not explore or push on that organization, fight it, is then silly, because then Spider-Man would know about the shadow cabal that's making everybody's life worse everywhere, and not pushing to fight that, and instead is just fighting the stuff that he would then know to just be distractions against the bigger plot. And that never settled well, and that was because Mark Miller, writing that, didn't understand what he was playing with. I don't think Mark Miller understands superheroes at the end of the day, whereas James Robinson does, and this worked in this context for the Fantastic Four. Once we have the Quiet Man set up, it's all a push, but there is a fun twist as we get there. And as we're playing, they bring in the Sleepwalker at the last minute, which is a weird character to bring in for the final issues of the Fantastic Four for the foreseeable future. And ultimately, it's Psycho Man who's the main villain, which plays off of the play of malice being used against the Invisible Woman throughout this run. It's a really good play at the last minute to add a little twist and tension, and we do have a big Marvel brawl, so unlike the final cover of Matt Fraction's run, which evoked it for no reason, here we only have the four, but this could have, I feel like you could have swapped those covers and it would have made more sense for each of the issues. I think the ending here is satisfying for the run. If you're looking for an ending for the Fantastic Four, this isn't it. But really, the end of that is in Secret Wars. That's happening around the same time, and that also explains why Doom kind of drops off here. Which also, to Robinson's credit here, is trying to play with this weight of what he's doing here, along with the fact that he started off his run to dismantle and then rebuild the Fantastic Four in a new light. And then he's writing the last Fantastic Four comic so far as he knows. Which is why it's a weird exercise in irony. I overall think this is a really interesting run. I think it's ultimately more successful than the Matt Fraction run right before it. And I know I'm drawing a direct comparison, A, because I just read that, B, it's the one right before, and C, I don't have any full runs of Fantastic Four to really compare it with that are of comparable length, at least. Um, and they are also the only two runs of the Fantastic Four that are handled in this kind of volume to creator length that puts a different weight on them, I believe, along with the unique logoing. And one fun thing they did with the covers is they have their Fantastic Four logo, and then you get to the last four, and it's theirs, and then the slightly more recent one, but not the Mad Fraction one, and then their middle of the run kind of logo, and then the first logo, and then we're out. Um, yeah, it was good design. Um, I would say this is well worth digging up, and having read this now, it answers some of the questions that I had about why Slots Run hasn't really addressed a lot of the Matt Fraction stuff, and that's because a lot of it was waylaid throughout here. But there are also certain things brought up in Robinson's Fantastic Four that have yet to be answered now that the characters are back together, that aren't really dealt with, in large part due to the fact I think there's so much time between Robinson's run and Slott's run. But if you're going through it retroactively, it does feel like Slott's leaving a lot on the table for no reason, just kind of pressed forward. So it's been interesting with a little more context to see it, though. I would say overall, I think Slott's run has been a lot of fun and has bring back a lot more of the energy of what the Fantastic Four should be, instead of trying to dissect them or do something new or revolutionary, but just trying to tell good Fantastic Four stories, as it were. So, I don't know. The run's not too long. You can probably find it relatively cheaply. Certainly digitally, it's easy to get. So, worth digging through. But probably not the best of the Fantastic Four, but an interesting moment for comics history. Because, I mean, this is one of the few times where a big title stopped for a long time, and this was the note it went out on. And I think with the weight of that, it's interesting to read. So, there you go. Cheers. Have a good one.